all but one. We've met Steve, Tom and Martin, but I'd like to also introduce Professor Nathalie Nguyen. And Nathalie is a professor of history at Monash University, the author of several books studying in particular the memories of South Vietnamese soldiers, a very important part of the overall experience of this war. The topic of our session is wide-ranging. And it's a session where you ask your questions and the panel can answer if they wish. The topic is, was this a winnable war? And if not, what were the alternatives? Ladies and gentlemen, over to you. Please put your hand up and we'll take you in sequence. The first question. Right at the back from our convener.
Steve, to you in the first instance, there was that remarkable fellow, I think his name was Edward Lansdale.
Yes.
That had been in the Philippines organising against the Hucks or the Hooks, and then came to Vietnam and was killed later in the war, and was not a military person per se, but obviously socially blind. Now, if I understand it correctly, his concept was more working with the villagers, the people in the ground, get support of the people, rather than big military operations. Are you able to comment on his approach to the war? And because he was killed, it was never implemented properly. So,
well, thank you. Yes, and Colonel Ed Lansdale, U.S. Air Force. He of course was very much a supporter of President Nguyen. He did, I'm pretty sure, play a hand and have a hand in the creation of the strategic Biennial program in South Vietnam. And I think there's still kind of a debate on the effectiveness of that specific program. The strategic, for those of you who are not familiar, the strategic handling program was basically an attempt of the Diem government to engage in population control and resource denial operations against the Viet Cong. And basically what they wanted to do was isolate the Vietnamese villager population and to get them out of the EC controlled areas, the National Liberation Front controlled areas, deny them access to both a recruiting pool, of course, of young men who might serve in the National Liberation Front, but also other resources, food, and things like that. There are some who criticize that program as being very insensitive to the actual Vietnamese people. There was an incredibly strong tie. There still is a very strong tie between Vietnamese individually and as families to their land. They have ancestral tombs on their land. And so to just say, okay, we're going to uproot you and push you into this foreign village that makes no sense to an average Vietnamese villager, and to basically force you to live in this barricaded enclave away from your lands, away from your tombs, your family's tombs. It was very disruptive of Vietnamese life and created a lot of resentment. In addition to that, those strategic hamlets were supposed to have been fully supplied with the resources needed for people to build homes and things like that. And typically what happened was graft and corruption typically entered the situation, and instead of being given the resources to build homes, people were forced to buy those resources at exorbitant prices. And so it was an interesting concept, and it did mirror some of the other counterinsurgency types of policies in other regions of Asia and the Pacific, especially again in terms of population control and resource denial operations. But I think it was a very limited and mixed success. There are some historians that say, well, there's evidence that the North Vietnamese were concerned about strategic hamlets. At the same time, it seemed like the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front, could still effectively recruit and effectively get around a lot of the restrictions that were supposedly put in place. And I would love to open it up to my fellow panel members to also address these issues and share their perspectives.
Yeah, I think some of them were successful. And I think some of the Vietnam people have already been displaced. And I'm thinking, first of all, of the northern refugees, so the refugees in northern Vietnam. Some of the settlements were successful and were pro-government right until the end of the war. Others were less so. I mean, the Americans wanted to hand out money to the people that do the work. Then that is wrong idea of first, a Vietnamese version or South Vietnamese version regarding, democracy. And his view was that people should actually earn assistance rather than expect handouts. So there was already a conflict between Diem and the Americans, in the sense that Diem had this idea that people should work, should achieve as much as possible through their own means, and he objected to American handouts for that reason. So obviously, in theory, this was a good idea. People should, if you work hard at something, then you can claim.
You don't want a national welfare budget.
Yes, well, then you can claim, you've worked hard for it, you've established it, you own it. But obviously, in practice, sometimes it was very difficult, and then people ended up, in some ways being forced to do some form of hard labor. So there are, it does vary because there were successful settlements and others that were rather less so. But the picture did vary across.
But and thank you for saying that, because I think you raise a very important point, and that is, there were different refugee populations that were put into these handbooks. And the northern refugee population which was predominantly Catholic.
Yeah, but they were also a lot of Buddhists.
Right. So they were displaced from North Vietnam. They came south as part of Operation Passage to Freedom. Is that correct? Yeah. And so they're kind of a population that is ripe for that kind of program because they don't have homes yet. But for the South Vietnamese population, who did have homes already and did live in their own villages, to be uprooted from them and said, you have to live here.
Yeah,
That's incredible.
less successful.
Those are the unsuccessful ones, and I think those are probably the majority.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers. But one thing I do want to point out about the northern refugees, and I think a lot about the northern refugees because my father was from the north. So my father comes from a very large Buddhist clan in the north, the Nguyen. And it's a very old family of scholars that dates its history back to the 15th century because two brothers were successful at the doctoral examinations. It was very rare. So they're recorded in the history books. So it was a family with a very long history in the north, a very close association to land. But what they objected, there was a family of patriots as well, but what they objected to was communism. They saw communism as a divisive and destructive foreign creed. And so members of the family actually started leaving the north from the late 40s onwards. So that figure of about 1 million refugees who went from north to south in 54, 55, it's actually an underestimate because a lot of people, like my father's family, started moving south from the late 40s. And my father left the north in 1950. And his uncle and best friend, they were the same age. I mean, that was not unusual with families. Women basically gave birth from their 20s right through to their 50s. That's what happened to my great-grandmother. His uncle and best friend was conscripted into the Northern Army. And the only reason my father wasn't conscripted was because he wasn't home at that time. But he moved south. And so for people like my father, losing the South was terrible. But coming back to that refugee movement, you have to keep in mind that South Vietnam was this very small country. There was no census taken, so it's a little bit difficult, regarding figures. But I remember seeing an intelligence report that South Vietnam had a population of about 9 million. The North had a population of about 13 million. With the North-South movement, so the South would have gone up to 10 million, the North would have gone down to 12 million, but the population in the North was still higher than the South. Now you imagine Australia, where 26 million people, if 1 million refugees, landed, here, we get hysterical about a few thousand refugees. So, the fact that South Vietnam, which was this new small country emerging from colonization and partition, and that it was able to absorb 1 million refugees from the north and do so reasonably successfully is one of the great achievements of the Diem government, and people tend to forget about that. And some of those, many of the northern refugees who moved south, they actually had, like my father did, they actually had experience of communism.
Because the problem with the Southerners is most people have no idea what communism was. They only experienced that after 1975, after the fall of Saigon, when people started to disappear in re-education camps, or they were forcibly displaced and sent to the new economic zones. But for people from the north, like my father, they witnessed what the reality of communism was. And he remembers, the murders that occurred, on the communist side between the Stalinists and the Trotskyites. He remembers a villager pleading for his life before he was actually killed by Stalinists. So his view was that if they're that cruel to their own, they're even worse to their political opponents. So it's very much this view of Vietnam and what happened, even well before partition in 54, 55. That's the history that and the lived experience that I have, from my father.
And while we're waiting for the next question, just to add very quickly, I understand the desire not to be a large state in southern Vietnam. At the same time, again, if you're looking at from the standpoint of South Vietnamese citizens who have not been displaced from the north, they have homes, they have villages, and now they're being told, hey, you have to live over here. Oh, and by the way, you have to pay for it. I mean, again, this is going to just add insult to injury, right? Not only are we taking you off your land, we're making you pay for the privilege of living in where we're telling you to live. And I think, that's going to engender a lot of ill will.
Well, and, sorry, just one final point on that. Sam's brother Nguyen was like sorry, how do you say it? No, his brother? Nguyen, yeah. Weird dude, and one of, he took this idea of self-reliance to the extremes of villagers are expected to win their own weapons off the front. We'll give you, a few guns, and then you run an ambush, and you take the guns off the front, and then again, you might, it's a huge leap from being opposed to communism or being loyal to the state, and then being asked to suddenly be an untrained soldier to sustain yourself. So there was a certain level of delusion, really, in some of these schemes. Yeah.
Can I add briefly the Australian experience of resettlement within Phuoc Tuy province, as I saw it for part of the time as an intelligence officer? First of all, there was a village in the north of Phuoc Tuy which was entirely Catholic, which had come from the north, and it settled in an isolated area, and it was pretty happy during our occupation of that area of the province. Indeed, so happy that when we set up a fire support base within a few thousand metres of them, they all came to greet us, and I captured them single-handedly, all 350 of them, which is not recorded as the biggest capture in the Vietnam War, but it comes close. But the second one was far more traumatic, and that is the Australians told a Vietnamese village in the area of the Battle of Long Tan, they were resettled to a new village. And how well did that go? Well, the factors mentioned came into play, and a new village was partially constructed for them. It wasn't particularly successful, and I should leave it at that. Yes.
During the war, the Vietnam War, an Australian journalist called Wilfred Burchett was a collaborator recognised by our government as being one, and I think his passport was revoked by Whitlam because of his activities. Now, he was more than a sympathiser, more than a fifth columnist, he was a traitor. And my question is, was this a winnable war? To what extent, on a percentage basis, was publicity a contributor? In other words, how successful were journalists in pushing against it being a winnable war? 50%, 80%, 10%? Where would you believe?
After the Tet Offensive, sorry, prior to the Tet Offensive in '68, the war narrative in the US and Australia, which I also agreed was pro-war. We're here for a reason, doing good work, and we're winning. The Tet Offensive, despite the fact that it was a complete and utter tactical and operational disaster for the North and the Viet Cong, was an incredible strategic success because it changed the message, and the media was very quick to pick up on this. because quite a few of them actually lived through the worst part of the Tet Offensive. It changed the narrative in terms of, well, if we're winning, how is it that the opposition can now do this and do it all over Vietnam? Despite the fact that it took them nearly 2 years to recover back to the same infrastructure they previously had prior to Tet. But it changed the narrative. And Walter Cronkite was probably one of the most well-known and respected journalists in the US who, prior to Tet, was largely pro-war. But he changed his narrative post-Tet Offensive. And I think it was Johnson, but please don't hold me to it, but when Cronkite went out live to the American people criticising the war and its management, Johnson said, when I lost Cronkite, I knew I'd lost the war. And I think that was a very strong message that with any sort of war of this nature, it's a war of beliefs more than anything else. And what we believe is based on the information we receive. And the media is very influential in that, the nature of the information that we get and build our belief system around it.
Let's go to another question. Fine. Want to respond to it?
Sure, just very briefly. The only thing I'd add is there's a crisis of credibility, as I mentioned before, going back to the very early stages of U.S. involvement. When you look at the Battle of Bak in 1963, where the South Vietnamese forces went up against a relatively small group of NLF forces, the South Vietnamese army armed with helicopters, APCs, M16s, M60s, again a larger force than the opposing NLF force, and they basically got their hats handed to them, and it was a disaster. Now, John Paul Vann was on site. He called it a disaster. Yet going back to Saigon, General Harkins is telling the media, oh no, this is a great victory, this is a great success. So there's this incredible dichotomy between, and there was a media presence in Vietnam that knew what was actually happening in the field. And so you've got on the one hand, you've got this real reality that things aren't really going all that well as early as '63, but the general commanding U.S. forces at the time saying, oh no, everything's great and getting better. And so that I think started us down this unfortunate path of policymakers and senior military officials saying one thing about the war, where journalists on the ground were seeing something completely different. And that war can't be sustained with that, especially a war where political will is so central. I mean, in this war, that was a key factor. And that crisis of credibility has continued to build over the years. Listen, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to mention Neil Davis, the Australian journalist, because Neil Davis actually went out with South Vietnamese troops. So he was quite unusual. I mean, you keep in mind South Vietnam, country at war, you had masses of foreign journalists. In contrast to that, North Vietnam was a closed society. People didn't really know what was going on. And there were very few journalists that were aware of this asymmetry. They somehow didn't question the fact that, there was this vast difference in terms of perception between North and South, because the South, with all its flaws, was visible to everyone. In some cases, the flaws were exaggerated, and in some cases, some of the so-called, people who informed Western journalists later admitted that they were actually communist agents. And I thought, the documentary about Neil Davis, I always thought, was very, very moving, because Neil Davis actually went out with South Vietnamese troops. He filmed them being killed in action. He said, yes, he's very popular at the moment to denigrate the soldiers of, actually this was later. But from his point of view, they were very good. They did a lot of the fighting and they did a lot of the dying. In fact, they did most of it. So I think, it might have been too positive at one stage, but then it went the other way and became, a blanket, condemnation of the South. And it became quite distorted as well. To the point that, in terms of the Hue massacre, for example, in 1968, the communist massacre, there were apparently journalists on site who could have filmed or taken photographs, of the mass graves of victims of the communist massacre. But they were so against the idea of South Vietnam, they said, oh, we're not going to do that. It's propaganda. We're going to go somewhere else. So I think this whole notion of the press, I think it kind of went one way and then it kind of went too much in the other direction. And then I think if something becomes very popular to be negative about something, then everybody kind of gets on board. I think that's why Neil Davis was so exceptional, because He went out with the South Vietnamese troops, and then he went out with the Cambodian troops when he went to Cambodia. So his view was very, very different from that of so many Western journalists who basically went out with the US troops. And that was their view of the Vietnam War.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I just throw in really quickly? For all the shift after Tet, US voters went to the ballot box in November 1968 and elected noted peacenik Richard Nixon. And the election, that was also the election in which George Wallace carried the Deep South for reasons that probably didn't have much to do with Vietnam, but again, he was very much an even more aggressive pro-war candidate than Nixon. He had Curtis LeMay as his, nuclear weapons enthusiast Curtis LeMay as his vice president. So I think we have to be careful of, in all history, whenever you are writing it, you work backwards from what has happened, and that is sound, but it goes to sort of the centre of this question as well. There is a danger in overlooking an alternate reality. I went to a great conference at Texas Tech where a lot of people bagged Lubbock. Can I say I'm pro Lubbock? I enjoyed Lubbock tremendously. You should all go.
Appreciate that.
But a professor, I can't remember his name, he taught in Georgia, but his paper was really interesting. It was on kind of pro-war sentiment being sent to a Democratic senator from his constituents in Georgia, and it did really reinforce this idea that the war became less popular, but that did not mean it still did not have a significant chunk of the public who supported it right up until the end. And I think you see that kind of fracture, in the divisions in the literature that persist afterwards, right? There always was a huge constituency for fighting the war in Vietnam right up until the end.
If I may, considering what we just talked about in terms of the media, Vietnam is considered the first pop culture war as well, and the first war that was televised, if you like, and this caused a lot of conversation. The second part of the question is, we've decided it's not winnable. What were the alternatives?
Did we decide it's not winnable?
Yeah.
Can we conclude that one?
We haven't exactly, but no. Look, from my perspective, just to try and look at this question as a whole, just briefly, while I think Vietnam War was an avoidable conflict, which is very different from a winnable conflict, it was avoidable, had there been a little bit more backbone, for want of a better term, shown towards the communists post-1945, because that's a whole new other conference, I suppose, but there had been an awful lot of kowtowing to Stalin and in the post-war environment. A different strategy, a different diplomatic approach potentially could have avoided Vietnam. However, I don't know if the ultimate outcome would have been remarkably different, other than having avoided an awful lot of casualties. But we may have had a better relationship with whatever government developed. But it's all what-if stuff. But once the war was started, the nature of the conflict, the delicate relationship between the West and the East at the time, and the nature of the Cold War, it wasn't going to be winnable if they couldn't resolve the broader issues of the Cold War. They weren't going to be able to resolve the issues within Vietnam. Being very, very broad there, I suppose. At best, they may have prolonged the war, but once it was started, I think the outcome was inevitable. It was just a question of when that ultimate outcome was going to occur. Without a seismic shift on the Cold War front, Vietnam was locked in.
I've got an alternative view, but derived partly from what Major General McLaughlin said in an interview not long before he died, and also some conversations with some retired CIA people of my acquaintance. I don't think that the Washington or the West actually intended to win the war in the conventional sense. of make this particular country surrender, like they've done to Japan and so forth, but rather look at it as part of the Cold War, where they would sort of move into a war, get the Soviets to support the other side, then jump out and then leave that country as a hanger-on of the Soviet Union. And this was done a number of times, I believe, like not just in Asia and Africa and so forth. And in the end, when the Soviet Union sort of tottered to a complete collapse, like it was propping up, I think it was about 23 basket case countries around the world. And so basically, the whole thing was sort of like part of a greater war, but the plan wasn't to win this part of the war, we'll just keep it going until it wins the main enemy, the Soviet Union, wears them down, and they just collapse.
With respect to your CIA friends, I think that might be a post hoc justification for what occurred. Oh, yeah, no, Steve.
Yeah, based on the American records that I've seen, there's nothing to justify support that. I mean, the United States was committed to protecting South Vietnam from falling to communism the same way we had been committed to South Korea and keeping them from falling to communism. So I think that was the goal. Basically turn South Vietnam into South Korea and basically create that same kind of dynamic of, we're going to help South Vietnam grow and become a powerhouse in Southeast Asia, just like we did on the Korean Peninsula with the Republic of Korea. I don't see that as in any way plausible that we expected to just eventually drop South Korea, let it fall to communism, and then that becomes some kind of an albatross around the neck of the Soviets. That's not in any way a credible theory in my understanding. Yeah, so interesting, but just doesn't make a whole lot of sense based on the historical record.
The interview with Major General McLaughlin was that the reporter said, we lost the Vietnam War. And his answer was, well, no, we didn't quite. We reached the war aims. And he stated the war aims as being that we so weakened North Vietnam that it could not bother anyone except its close neighbourhood. Whereas had they not conducted the war, it may have been strong enough to move across and invade Thailand and so forth. That was what he was saying. And that was Major General McLaughlin saying that. So.
Again, very interesting perspective, but it kind of belies what actually happens in Southeast Asia. I mean, again, the American investment to keep South Vietnam free from communism is incredible. It was America's longest war into the war in Afghanistan. Again, billions of dollars spent, tens of thousands of lives lost, and an incredible investment of American prestige in keeping South Vietnam free. And then, with the fall of Saigon, yes, I mean, the discussion, the debate on, did we win tactically? Did we achieve our goals? Well, the U.S. government was selling the war in South Vietnam as a war of containment. And the sole goal was to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communism. South Vietnam fell to communism. I mean, we failed in our primary war aim. And so that, to me, is defeat. No matter how you slice it. That's my own perspective, but I don't see that as a victory. And, of course, communism does spread. Laos and Cambodia eventually become communist. Right? Now, it doesn't go as far as Thailand and Burma and India and all the rest, but those two other countries did fall to communism. And, of course, two of them remain of the 5 communist countries in the world, Laos and Vietnam. And so I don't see it as it's hard for me to accept that as a logical approach to understanding.
Sorry, just real quick, that's the Lee Kuan Yew theory, right? Is, Lee Kuan Yew, the leader of Singapore, argued afterwards that, the sacrifice in Vietnam had brought time for anti-communist forces elsewhere in Southeast Asia to triumph and so stop a domino theory. I think, he's in a better position to judge what happened in Singapore than we are, but certainly, he was, sorry. But you look at what happened in Indonesia, for example, at the end of 1965 with the destruction of the Indonesian Communist Party and the rise of Suharto and New Order. certainly like the Johnson administration at the time saw that as a vindication that, you know, they believed that the Indonesian generals had taken that step because of the stand the Johnson administration had taken in Vietnam. I think we still don't really know what happened on that night in Jakarta, but certainly I think we can say it was more, it was driven by internal Indonesian factors rather than an interaction with the Vietnam conflict.
Just a basic Vietnam War 101 question, if I may. In the context of political winnable war, Australia and America and our allies went to war with a mixture of conscripts and regular army. What was the case with the Viet Cong and the NLF, the ARVN and the North Vietnamese forces? Were they conscripts? Were they regular army? How did it work?
So People's Army of Vietnam was a conscript force, so that's the North Vietnamese Army. The National Liberation Front, the People's Liberation Armed Forces, so the armed wing of the NLF, was notionally a volunteer force, but in practice, yeah, like...
they impressed.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting, even if you look at Phuoc Tuy, where obviously the Australians were, there's a distinct sort of change as combat operations escalate in 64, 65, where you have people who'd been joining the front to that point for various, you know, what might be called idealistic or material or self-interest reasons, but they start, you know, kidnapping people from hamlets, and that maybe sees a bit of a downturn in the front's fortunes. The ARVN are conscripted. Nathalie can speak better to that than I can, and then obviously, yeah, the Australian Army, it's about, depending on the unit, it's about a 50-50 split.
Yeah, I'm sure there were conscripts, but there were also volunteers, and it's particularly for the elite elements of the RVNAF, the Rangers, the Marines, the Marine Corps, the Airborne Division, and I think what particularly interested me, because I went to university, I was particularly interested in why university graduates then not only volunteered to serve, I mean they were expected to because, you know, everyone was doing so, but then, you know, volunteered to serve in the elite units, because the elite units had particularly high casualty rates. I mean, the Rangers, the Marine Corps, and the Airborne Division in South Vietnam had terrible casualty rates. So it really meant something. I mean, I know that the men I've interviewed have said that it was, I mean, they were young. You know, they were young guys in their 20s. They wanted to serve their country. There was a lot of bravado involved with that as well. Although one of them rightly said, you know, he graduated last in his course, so he ended up in the Marine Corps. But then he then became an excellent officer, and he was very, very proud of that service. And then he wrote, you know, this, you know, 2-volume history of that service. So there were different reasons for people to do that. But I mean, one thing that was, you know, that happened, for example, in 1972 during the 1972 offensive, is that apparently it really the number of volunteers was higher than the number of conscripts. So a lot of young people volunteered at that point. I mean, you know, the South Vietnamese, I think, population was kind of pretty much sitting on the fence for a very long time. And apparently the first big shock was 1968. You know, when the communists, you know, opened this huge front and attacked so many towns and cities. And I mean, the communists, you know, in policy was the Great Uprising. You know, they thought that they would attack the South and that the people of the South would rise up against the government. Of course, that did not happen at all. If anything, you know, it meant that people who were sitting on the fence then became pro-government because they were so shocked about the fact that, you know, the North attacked at Tet, you know, Tet, which is such an important holiday for the Vietnamese. So I think whenever with the South, I mean, the South suffered enormously. I mean, in terms of the casualties in the South, the recorded casualties are 254,000, but those figures only go up to 74, and they only start relatively late. So the overall figure is much closer to the 300,000 that, you know, Steve mentioned. And the number of wounded, probably about 1 million. I mean, in one book, they noted that, you know, 1 out of every 9, you know, men who served, you know, the government was either killed or seriously wounded. So the scars in terms of South Vietnamese society were horrendous. You know, everyone knew of someone who was actually, you know, who had actually been hurt or killed. And the effects of that in terms of families, a lot of soldiers, young soldiers had wives or they had young children. The effects were terrible for the South. And a lot of that always seems to be forgotten. In Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, I saw an article saying, only about 125,000 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed in the war. But where did you get that figure from? The figures provided by the US Center for Military History is, where I draw part of that information. And because that information is limited, so that you know that there were more people killed before and more people killed after. And that gives you a sort of closer idea of the actual numbers, the numbers of dead. It was interesting that Steve said that it was roughly about 200,000 missing as well from the South. And this whole issue of reconciliation that people, often ask about. I mean, one thing you need to do is to respect the dead of the opposite side. And if you don't do that, if you don't do that, you can't really talk about reconciliation. I can see where the difficulty is with the North, in terms of admitting that, because if they admit that the people in the South fought for their country, that they were patriots, that they were nationalists, then it partly delegitimizes their own, the existence of the Communist Party and the existence of the DRV, or now the SRV. So, you can only go so far, from their point of view, in admitting, what the South did and the sacrifice of the Southern soldiers. Because if you admit that they were doing what you were doing, then it kind of, wipes out your own argument for taking over the entire country and having the entire state as a one-party state. Sorry, I kind of went.
Paul, I think you're next.
That 200,000. This is a question, I guess, for Nathalie, and it's meant no offence to you, Steve. And it's about the mineral waters. I served in the same unit as Mike in 1970, and I went back to Vietnam a few times, and one of them was in 2007, when I went with a group of veterans from AGO, my unit, 7 and part of the schedule was to go to Bahria and to have a luncheon with people we were told were ex-D445 battalion. And whether they were or not, I don't know, but they were the same age as us. Anyway, we sat down and we had a few beers and we had some nice food. And I was asking questions of the D445 men. I asked 2 questions. What do you think of Australians as soldiers? And how is your government treating you now? And the first question, they probably answered the way they thought what I wanted to hear. But one of them said to me, you Australians were very good jungle soldiers. If you had thought you were fighting on the wrong side, if you'd been fighting on our side, we'd have got the Americans out of their 10 years before we did. That's what he said. I guess it's about Vietnamese perceptions, whether that is real or not, whether it was just a Vietnamese soldier, ex-soldier with a few beers keeping me happy, I don't know. But I'd be interested in your response to
that. Mia, who's speaking tomorrow, has done a lot of... I think she's still speaking tomorrow? No, I should pull it up. Tragic. But she's done a lot of work with that, on this idea that, to what extent is the welcoming back of Australian veterans a political project from the party designed to improve relations, and to what extent is it, a grassroots kind of movement from, veteran to veteran? I think the answer is maybe it's a bit of both. We don't have unless one day we crack the archives in Hanoi, we possibly won't have a good answer to that.
Sorry, I didn't give you the answer to the second question about how veterans are treated. And he said not very well.
I might say that there's a problem, except with PhD people, of extrapolating from a sample of one.
And even though you don't want me to answer the question, I do want to say one thing. Australians are great jungle fighters. I think the best American units weren't the conventional fighting forces. They were the unconventional forces, special forces, the mobile advisory teams, the CAP Marines, the Civic Action Program. Those were unconventional fighters, they were jungle warriors, and they were by far, I think, the most effective way to fight the war. Unfortunately, they were pushed down because General Westmoreland wanted to do the big battalion sweeps.
Yeah. And most of your draftees were much younger than we were, and they didn't have the length of time and training as we did. And there's also the issue of replacement, where we went over as units. I think some of your draftees didn't, they went over individually, is that correct?
Yeah, oh yeah, we had an individual rotation policy. Basically, as a soldier was killed in a unit, an individual soldier was sent to replace them. But the Cap Marines, I think they had quite a bit of experience, and they certainly had seasoned NCOs that were part of those units and an officer, as well as the MAT teams, who were all trained at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, language training. These were not green soldiers. These were guys well trained and experienced.
Mike, this may not be a fair question, but from the 65 onwards, are the panel prepared to say, yes or no, was the war winner?
Are we still being filmed?
There's not only one but two.
I mean, one thing you'd probably say there is, what does... Oh, this is such an academic answer. What is winnable? but in all seriousness, go back to that Lee Kuan Yew argument as well. The Australian government doesn't necessarily have a stake in the idea of the Republic of Vietnam surviving, whereas victory for the Republic of Vietnam is the survival of the Republic of Vietnam. So, there's a scenario in which you can argue the Australian government, does something different in 65 and still achieves its political objectives. But those are very different to the political objectives of the RVN. So, I would caveat it with that. But yeah, as a metaphysical thing, I think the point Luke made earlier of you read all these structural explanations for why the communist victory was inevitable, and you think, yeah, they're very convincing, and then you apply them to something like the Korean War, where, also an Asian civil war, where clearly the Western participants had no idea, even less idea, about the internal politics of Korea than we did about Vietnam, and yet, certain facts of geography render that a victory of sorts. So
it's a critical answer. Based on what you know, what your gut feeling is, yes or no,
watch me tap dance. Probably post 65 no.
Just what I said, from 65.
From 65 onward, this is one view. From 65 onwards, theoretically, yes, of course it's winnable, but there are so many factors that have to change to achieve that victory. And when you look at each individual factor, it's difficult to see how change could have successfully occurred in a cascading effect to lead to that victory. It's this what if issue is really awkward. I think it's probably we're all sitting up here feeling vaguely uncomfortable because we're just guessing at the end of the day because we don't know what might have happened with different decisions, different commitments, different strategic environments, a different decision being made in the Kremlin one day. We just don't know. But within, I think roughly predictable decisions that were being made from 65 onwards, no, I don't think the war was winnable. The only thing that I think could have changed would be the date of that victory, maybe in the late 70s or early 80s, but I think it was inevitable given the entrenched dogma of the North Vietnamese government that this was the long war. They'd already been fighting for 30 years against multiple colonisations, invasions, etc., etc. They were just going to stick at this and they weren't going to stop.
So you're a no, is that right?
I think we're going to have to leave it at that stage.
Nathalie,
Mike. Of course.
Sorry, can I just...
Then we'll have one question.
I just wanted to say a few things. I'm not sure if I'm actually answering the question, but I wanted to say a few things about, what was happening in the South. because there's still this perception that the North, was these barefoot soldiers. In fact, they were very well armed. They were much better armed than the South. Because up until 1968, the South Vietnamese soldiers, the average South Vietnamese soldier was still armed with the M1 from World War II. Much heavier, much clumsier, much slower weapon. And even the elite units, up until 1968. Now, 1968 happened, the Americans were pretty shaken up, and it was after that point that they finally started arming the South Vietnamese with the M16. So up until then, every time there was an encounter between the South Vietnamese and the North Vietnamese, and in fact this happened during Tet, was that on the North Vietnamese side there was the rat-tat-tat of AK-47s, and on the South Vietnamese side it was bang, bang from the M1s. So, people tend to forget, again, the fact that there were very different armies in the South with, and were armed at a very different level. And obviously the regional and popular forces in the South, it was even worse. They often didn't have proper helmets, they didn't have proper boots. It was only later on, towards the end of the war, that they were properly armed. So there was something about the Americans not arming their allies properly until...
I think, to be fair, American units didn't all get the M16.
Yeah,
so there's so many coming out of that.
Steve?
Yeah, and the other thing was, what happened in the last few years of the war, which Judin sort of mentioned, was the notion of this cut-off in funding. Because by the end of the war, South Vietnamese soldiers were reduced to 3 bullets per day. There wasn't any petrol, so trucks didn't work, planes couldn't fly, helicopters couldn't fly. I've interviewed South Vietnamese, pilots. And this affected, operations. So I think it's already been said that the Americans withdrew their support while the Soviet Union and the Chinese continued to support the North. And once again, this asymmetry sort of led to the output that it did. But one major thing was that the North sent 1 million soldiers to the South. That's actually in the North Vietnamese histories. 1 million soldiers, 1 million northern soldiers were sent to the South. And this is excluding the main offensives. And the Paris Peace Accords left, over 150,000 North Vietnamese soldiers stationed in the South. Now, imagine in Australia, if you had 150,000 enemy soldiers on Australian soil, how difficult it would be to fight this war. I always tell my students, South Vietnam fought the war, with a wound in its side. It was bleeding all the way through. It had the Ho Chi Minh Trail, coming through. It had obviously, all of this was sort of funded from Hanoi, but you had the NLF, and yes, it was also partly a grassroots movement, but it was led by Hanoi. And again, people tend to forget that. So, South Vietnam, when you look at it in that way, it's a wonder that South Vietnam held out for as long as it actually did. And it did that because of the people, the people who fought for it.
Last word comes from an American.
I have to say one word. The answer is no, but I'm going to push it back to the beginning of the bombing of 1964. Once Johnson made the decision to start bombing North Vietnam on false pretenses with the Gulf of Tonkin incidents, that solidified the North Vietnamese will. Okay, fine, you're going to bomb us, we might as well go ahead and take the war to the South. And I think that solidified basically the inevitability of Northern victory. They were never going to give up. There was nothing that the United States or anybody else could do to stop that.
Folks, I'm going to stop you there because we're well over time. We need to stick to time, forgive me. What I was going to say was to, of course, thank the panel, but they're still here, and so are you, and you can ask them the questions that you like afterwards at your convenience. Would you join me in thanking them?